So this one's from M. Green. I've been on TRT yet? No. I've been on TRT something for 20 years and my levels are around 450 or so. And I imagine that's your total T, nanograms per deciliter. When I add DHEA, low dose rectal, my T goes up to the 900s. However, my libido is tanked. I'm 70 years old. Would pregnenolone help? Interesting question. Would love to be able to have a little bit of back and forth with you. This has got to be a male, Mr. Green, because I'm not sure what your thinking is here, but as usual, I'll go off on a tangent here, riff a little bit. Maybe I can answer the question by luck. First of all, to have testosterone levels of 450 nanograms per deciliter is probably a big part of the problem. That's not, in my experience, by the numbers, effective treatment. That's subtherapeutic. I've said this many times before. Since the 1950s, we used at least an assay of, testosterone levels of at least 800 nanograms per deciliter. Now, we use free testosterone more often than not to evaluate the numbers, but that would be the equivalent of, if we're using LabCorp, 16, if we're using Quest or others, 160. We'll skip all the baloney behind that, but there's a decimal place problem there. Anyway, and that's going to be fine for some people that are young enough, but what we find is once you get to that age where you're a TRT candidate, the levels to achieve effective therapy are way higher. And typically we're talking about a free testosterone of around 30 picograms per milliliter and a total of around 1,500 to get the best we're going to get out of this before you've really pretty much, I would say, saturated the androgen receptors. And even if you increased it, and I know this contradicts what I said earlier about, there was one study that used 600 milligrams of testosterone a week. But again, the measurement of what we were considering as valuable or not, I think is open to question. In my experience, clinically with patients, once you start going above that level, they don't notice a difference in how they're feeling and the resolution of symptoms that they originally came in, complaining about that are related to hypogonadism. So 450 sounds very, very low most of the time, especially given symptoms. Here he's talking about no libido, but low energy, lack of that joie de vivre, as the French say, inability to effectuate changes in your body composition despite doing all the right stuff and despite your age. Those are signs of hypogonadism, and I would expect that those are probably part and parcel of what he's talking about here, along with his relatively low total testosterone. So even up at the 900s, based on what I just said, he's probably not getting much therapeutic value. And with testosterone, I think I've said this before, you got to hit that minimum threshold, after which the symptoms resolve and before which they don't. If it's not linear in effect, I've found, for the most part. You have to get to that threshold and beyond, and then you say, wow, the patient typically says, wow, this is great, now I see what we're talking about. So I would say that the therapy is probably underdosed. Again, this should all be done with a doctor. The DHEA addition, you didn't mention the dose, but that's a remarkable increase in testosterone in my experience, assuming that's the reason why it's increasing, is from the conversion from DHEA to testosterone. That can be very dicey, and normally I wouldn't see that typically. I might see a bump of maybe 150, maybe 250 nanograms per deciliter, and then also bumps in things like dihydrotestosterone, or worse yet, certain estrogens. So I would say, and again, that's why I always say, if you're going to replace something, replace it directly rather than a precursor, because we're oftentimes, if not all the time, rolling the dice as to what that precursor ends up in converting to in the body. So anyway, would pregnenolone help? Well, based on what I just said, it wouldn't be my first choice, because you're kind of rolling the dice. Pregnenolone is not necessarily known for its ability to help with libido, what he mentions here. Typically, when patients are on TRT, libido comes into play when there's not a good balance between estrogen and testosterone. And there's been some study about the right balance between estrogen and testosterone, and the difference in male personalities anyway when it comes to being more genteel versus more caveman like or whatever. But more specifically referring to estrogen, whether there's a good ratio between testosterone and estrogen or not. In other words, testosterone itself, if the levels of testosterone go too low, in my experience, we'll see a change for the worse with libido, meaning less libido. In some even more rare cases, you'll see a lack of sensation in the genitalia. And that number, when we're using estradiol sensitive, tends to float around 21, 22 picograms per milliliter. So to be safe with those patients to say, you know what, doc, I've jumped on TRT, everything's great, but my libido. Then we'll experiment by letting the estradiol sensitive, which we use as a surrogate marker for all the estrogens, float up a bit, so that they might range between 25 to 35 picograms per milliliter, which in most laboratory reference intervals is still within normal limits. But then they go, wow, great, my libido's back. And it's strange because in my experience with these patients, there is really a tipping point that's severe. Above, let's just call it 25, no problems. But boy, when they hit that point and they drop down to, let's say, 20, it's not minor. It's a major. Hey, I lost everything. And of course, if you're the rare few that loses sensitivity in the genitalia, well, you can see how that would affect your libido, and it's vice versa, right? So I would focus on maybe evaluating those assays to see, and again, estradiol sensitive, not just estradiol serum. We've talked about that before, so I won't talk about the difference between the precision and therefore the accuracy of those. But that I would look into. Now, sometimes you'll find that some people, even on TRT, at a therapeutic dose, will say, everything's great but my libido. And it's not because we're over suppressing estrogen with an agent like an aromatase inhibitor or Arimidex, or by blocking with something like tamoxifen or another SERM. It's because they just don't make that much estrogen. There's not that much conversion, mainly at the liver, and they're really lean, so there's not much to contribute from fat cells, converting. So in those cases, oftentimes we'll add some HCG. Why? Because then there'll be some conversion. Sorry, not conversion. Beg your pardon. There'll be some production at an intratesticular level of estrogen that will be enough to get them up to an estrogen level where things are working properly again, the libido and erectile function, etc. So I would look into that. Again, to answer the question directly, no, I wouldn't jump on Pregnenolone necessarily. Pregnenolone is mainly for improvement in cognition or supporting cognition. Your appreciation of color is another thing. It's not the sexy hormone that testosterone is. But certainly you could consider adding it if you're short in it or you think it might help. 50 to as much as 200 milligrams per day is a typical dose for a supplement. And at least here in the United States, that's over the counter. But I don't think that's going to solve the problem. Bottom line, I would get into the assays, particularly testosterone free and total and estradiol sensitive, and see what the balance is and particularly what the estrogen level is, and go from there.
All right. Thanks, Doc. All right.
So the next question here says, no name, but 100 milligrams sip twice a week with HCG 500 IU twice a week. I have zero libido. Doctor just put me on an AI. When I first got on TRT a couple years ago, I felt great and libido was awesome. Now at 40 years old, libido's gone. Latest blood work was testosterone at 934 nanograms per deciliter and estradiol at 52 nanograms per deciliter. Well, this follows what we just were talking about. First of all, more than likely, just because you're talking about 100 milligrams twice a week, so you're on 200 milligrams of testosterone cypionate, and you're on a decent dose of HCG. So why is your total testosterone only 934 nanograms per deciliter? I would call this person perhaps an expensive date, I would say. You're burning through the testosterone somehow. Either you're breaking off the ester bond pretty quickly, and or you're metabolizing the testosterone very quickly. As I was mentioning earlier, the estradiol, I don't know if that's a serum or a sensitive, but I've seen a serum and a sensitive on the same test before, same blood draw, very different. 16 picograms per milliliter versus 64. They can be wildly different. So I would say that's if it's an estradiol serum, it's pretty much a worthless number for us. So can't make much of a comment except that maybe that's a factor. Maybe estrogen is oversuppressed per the question we were just referring to, and you might want to back off on the AI to see if that helps. And of course, do it with your physician and with labs so you know what the numbers say, and you don't let the estrogen get out of control. But that would be the first thing I would look into when you talk about loss of libido. In addition to what I guess I started to talk about, which is your testosterone is not enough. And maybe it was enough before, while you were younger. Maybe it was enough before when you weren't metabolizing as quickly. What's changed? I mean, there's so many things that I could bring up here if I were doing this the right way with a full history and physical, et cetera, and before and after information. But and so I won't speculate. But yeah, just based upon these numbers and what he's saying here, I would consider that maybe you need, and I like to use a more frequent dose of testosterone rather than a higher dose weekly. Maybe try, every 6 days or every 5 days of this dose. The other thing I don't like either, and it works for some people, but not everybody, and I used to say about 50-50, I can't say I changed my mind, but some people, when they divide a weekly dose into a bi-weekly dose, we've been talking about weekly doses forever. That's how we usually have been doing it. But, the new craze is to, microdose, they call it sometimes, or at least divide it into twice week dosage. I can't tell you why, but there must be something about having a nice peak, okay, that's higher than the 900 nanograms that makes it better, because the wheels have fallen off the wagon for a lot of my patients until we put them back on the original once a week dosing, and they go, oh, everything's back. So maybe try that too, and combining your 100 milligram dosages into once a week. Anyways, just some things to think about, and it's going to be an experimentation thing. I hope I've given you some things as a lead, but in general, again, to recap, the testosterone seems awfully low for someone on that dose, and look into maybe having oversuppressed the estrogen. Okay.
Awesome. Thanks, Doc. All right, Doc.
Okay, so the next one says, Dave, my questions for Dr. Rand are as follows. After starting TRT this past year with 100 milligrams of testosterone cypionate every 2 weeks, administered 1 time per week with a 50 milligram intramuscular gluteal injection using a 1.5 23 gauge needle, 1.5 inch, sorry. Number one, he says, latest blood work revealed a hemoglobin of 19. Wow. Will doing a therapeutic phlebotomy of 600 milliliters draw get my number into range? If not, how long do I wait before performing a second draw? Let me just stop there, because it looks like he's got 4 things attached to this. So if I might, just let me do them one at a time. So as we've talked about many times now up to this point, that's a really light TRT dose typically. If it works for you, great. If the symptoms and signs of hypogonadism have resolved, fantastic. Again, you treat people, not numbers, right? But by the numbers, this seems awfully light, such that honestly, there's a good possibility. It's funny because I just saw this in my one of my patients this week. You could actually be using such a dose that you're reducing your level of testosterone more so than before you started for most of the week. Yeah, because think about it, just like a girl who uses oral birth control, you're using some form of estrogen and progesterone, right? Oftentimes to tell your body, hey, you don't need to make any of this. We got you covered. And so, okay, we don't need to make it. And it's just enough so the body stops making it. It disrupts the cycle. I mean, there's all kinds of other reasons why we're doing it. But the effect is the same. If you use just a smidge, if you will, of testosterone, which I would argue this is, yeah, you might over time get, even just a few hours or maybe a day or two tops probably. I'm just guessing here. of some benefit and think, oh wow, I'm better for it. And this happens a lot with creams more so than injections, right? Just because of the nature of the way they're metabolized and the dosing. But in this case, and I've seen it where the starting level of testosterone, meaning before we start a TRT, ends up being lower the next time we assay it. I say we. These are obviously from, I shouldn't say obviously, but they are from other doctors, and they're coming to me to see if they can figure out what's going on. But anyway, you actually put yourself in a worse boat overall, where you spend more time at an even lower level of testosterone. Of course, presumably all the symptoms are even worse during that time period too. And I don't know why. Yeah, well, why do we wonder it doesn't work? Well, we don't. We know why. So I would argue that's probably what's going on here. And again, I would argue that typically, I mean, look at Baylor University, Dr. Lipschultz, one of my favorite docs out there. He starts people typically at 1 cc of 200 milligrams per ml testosterone cypionate, right? That's what most doctors in this field are starting, and this isn't even close. So again, everyone's different, but I would look into that as an issue using assays and, of course, feedback as to how it's treating you. In terms of a hemoglobin of 19, wow, that's really high. 19 grams per deciliter is something's going on here, because testosterone is needed to leverage that number up, to leverage the number of red blood cells and the deposition of hemoglobin on the red blood cell. 19 is something we'd see. We don't even see that in a Tour de France athlete who's riding 6 hours a day uphill every day. And let's use in the old days would even be using EPO, right? I mean, that's an incredibly high number. So one, I would look into the typical culprit. How bad is your snoring at night? Do you have sleep apnea? I would say you probably have severe sleep apnea, not just mild or moderate. And or do you have what's called a JAK2 gene mutation, JAK2? These are things that would get the body to produce more red blood cells and hemoglobin. Also, I didn't even, obviously we would be guessing, but if you're at a fairly high altitude, right, where oxygen is thin, your body's going to make the adjustment to make more hemoglobin and oxygen carrying capacity. But even if you lived at, 8,000 feet, if you're a mammoth, you're not going to be at 19, especially with this level of testosterone. So some things to look into there with question or remark number one. Number two, he says, should I adjust my dosage or injection frequency to keep my hemoglobin in range, or should I just do therapeutic phlebotomy every 6 to 8 weeks? Okay, so we already talked about adjusting the dosing, and in this case, it's in regards to his hemoglobin going up. Let me just remind what we've talked about before, remind everybody that, the testosterone's not doing it. It's not raising the hemoglobin hematocrit. A lot of people make that mistake, including physicians. Something else is doing it, and it's being leveraged by testosterone. In this case, not by much. So it's something else that's doing it. So adjusting the dosage to decrease the rise in hemoglobin, well, I don't think it, how much more can you decrease it? I don't think that's the issue. I think that to be therapeutic, we're going to have to raise the dosage of testosterone, separate issue. But in terms of letting this continue and using therapeutic phlebotomies, I don't remember the doctor's name, but probably a decade ago now, he is a hematologist, brought it to my attention that there is a reason for not doing serial therapeutic phlebotomies. There's a reason to not just saying, well, I'm not going to treat my sleep apnea. I'm good enough. I'm doing fine. I'll just keep drawing blood when I need to. And that begs another question. Do you need to? I'll come back to that in a second. But, you're digging into your stem cell stores, right? The hematopoietic stem cells are being used up, you would argue. It's not like, a genie where you just keep getting more and more wishes. Eventually you run out. And I think that he makes a very good point. And I wish I could give him credit. I don't remember his name, but it makes sense. Why use up your stores? Why not just fix the sleep apnea issue so you don't have this problem continue and you're not digging into your stem cell stores in the bone marrow? So, I would look into what the source of the rise that high in hemoglobin is in terms of, the need for therapeutic phlebotomies, I would say at 19, more than likely this gentleman has an issue with some side effects from it being that high. Typically when your hemoglobin goes above, in my experience, roughly around 18 and a half, patients will complain about dizziness. They stand up out of a chair and they're not dehydrated, they're not low on blood sugar, but yeah, when their blood is viscous, not like blood, but more like maple syrup, it takes an extra pump or two by the heart to get it the blood, which is pooled in the legs, up to the brain. And so they might have a couple seconds where they feel dizzy. Then we should thin it. We should reduce the viscosity with a therapeutic phlebotomy. That makes sense, right? Also, another sign is a patient will be just sitting there, and this sounds kind of counterintuitive, but they will take a deep breath, a heavy sigh for no reason, right? They're just sitting there like, well, why do I have to get a deep breath? And didn't you just say these are all, related to increased oxygen carrying capacity? And the way I explain it, which I guess makes some sense, yeah, you've got a bigger truck now. You can carry more stuff in the bed of the truck, but you've got a jam on the highway. You got too many trucks, okay? So you're not getting the oxygen where it needs to be, but your blood's too thick. It's really a lousy analogy when I think about it. But anyway, it does work against you when it's this thick. So somewhere around there, you might want to consider doing it, not because your blood is so sticky. It's not about stickiness, but because you're having side effects from it. But again, you're robbing Peter to pay Paul, I would argue, per the hematologist, who I'm not giving enough credit to. His explanation of what happened. So he says here, number 3, my hematocrit elevated to 57. My doc told me to take a baby aspirin each day until we get it down. How much will the hematocrit decrease with a therapeutic phlebotomy of 600 milliliters? So here's one that's lost in translation, I have to imagine, because when he says, my doc told me to take a baby aspirin each day until we get it down, you could read that and maybe imply that he's saying the baby aspirin will take it down. That's not the case. Unless he takes enough aspirin, baby aspirin, 81 milligrams, and unless the aspirin makes him bleed internally, which aspirin does. You get a little bit of blood typically from the stomach when you take an aspirin, but it shouldn't be enough to act like a therapeutic phlebotomy. I don't think that's what he means. I think he's saying that the doctor is going to address the blood stickiness again, even though we're talking about blood viscosity, by taking an antiplatelet like aspirin so it doesn't stick together until such time as they can reduce the viscosity of the blood. Does that work? Yeah, but I would argue that I would argue a better way to do it is take another effective anti-stickiness agent, fish oil. Loaded with omega-3 is great for myelinating the nerves and reducing inflammation. Same effect, but without the damage to the stomach. And by the way, that's no small thing. The biggest cause of peptic ulcers these days is NSAID use, of which aspirin is considered one, ibuprofen, that sort of thing. So yeah, let's avoid that problem if we can, right? So how much will 600 milliliters reduce it? Roughly 1 point of hemoglobin, which would be roughly 3 points of hematocrit. Okay, that's the general relationship between the two. So I hope that answers it. So you'd bring your 19 to maybe just a little below 18 if you gave up 600 mLs of blood. Then the fourth, he says, can you draw more than 600 mLs at one therapeutic phlebotomy draw? Or is that not recommended? Great question. Typically, they will, in this country, they will pull just 500, a half a liter, 500 mLs, not 600. And yet, you could argue that at the same time or shortly thereafter or somewhere in between, if you gave someone, a liter of fluid when you pulled off a liter of blood, there wouldn't be an issue. It would depend upon the starting hemoglobin, I would argue. It would depend upon the body habit, just how big a person is. I remember being at the risk of boring you with a quick story, I can remember being in the ER, and I worked at a hospital that was just a zoo. I mean, crazy. It was the best learning experience of my life. And someone came in with ascites, where you have a lot of fluid in the belly. And I remember the ER doc said, you ever done this before? I said, no, sir. He said, well, can you? I said, yes, sir. He looked at me like, kind of just sizing me up there because it really was so busy. And I guess he gave me the thumbs up and said, all right, go ahead. And anyway, long story short, I remember researching, the most you wanted to pull off, I think was recommended at either 8, maybe 10 liters. Otherwise, you risk, pulling off too much. It's just a big change to the body. You risk, I think it was hypotension and just a shock. So, and it's so funny, just kind of a side note, I remember the nurse, after I got myself set up doing the research, was like, no, go ahead, keep going. We were pulling them off a liter at a time. We had these vacuum bottles and whatnot. And we got to like 12 because the nurse was like, yeah, don't believe what you read. Let me tell you what, because she'd been through it. And, for any resident who might be listening, or any intern, the nurses probably know more, certainly know more than the residents and interns, but probably know as much or more than some of the doctors on the rounds. But anyway, what was my point? Sorry, I got off on a tangent, but you could technically pull off more as long as you could handle it. But the typical rule of this, at least in this country, is to pull off just a half liter at a time. Now, what you could do if you were trying to accelerate the process is, you could do it, and I do it here in the office, is I'll pull 500 one day and then tell them to come back at the end of the week. You could do it probably, again, depends upon the person, every couple of days. I would argue that you could probably pull off, again, depending on the starting and finishing level, a full liter, as long as they're hydrated enough, okay? So someone's, got 11, it all depends again on the person, but 11 liters flowing. Well, you pull off a liter, that's a significant amount, not quite 10%, but that's, that's a lot. And just 2% dehydration, for example, can affect you negatively. So that's why they do it. Now, there is another technique that he might be interested in if he's trying to adjust this quickly. We used to call it double reds, where what they'll do is they'll use something that looks like a dialysis machine, and they'll pull the blood from one arm and put it back in, but they'll remove the red blood cells without removing anything else. When they're pulling blood with a therapeutic phlebotomy, they're pulling whole blood, the whole thing. When they use a machine, they're pulling just the red blood cells, which is what we're trying to lower, and they put everything back in. So you can take, in this case, twice as much they feel comfortable doing. So it can speed the process. And then, here he says, I'm sorry. Thank you for any help you may offer. You're welcome. His name is Thomas Lee, 56-year-old male. So, okay. I don't think that changes anything I would recommend. A 56-year-old male, yeah, that's a really light dose of testosterone typically for someone that age.
All right. Thanks, Doc.